Oh, well, hello there, and welcome to day 46 of A Film a Day with me, Jordan Woodley. Now, what I've decided to do, as you may have anticipated with my Foxcatcher discussion on Friday, is partner it up with the documentary from 2016, Team Foxcatcher. And again, if you have seen this video but not the Foxcatcher one, these two will hopefully be quite nice companion pieces together. It's interesting, the fact that I had never heard of John Dupont before seeing... I'd not heard of Foxcatcher until the film had come out in 2014. And I'd not heard of John Dupont until I watched the film for the first time on Friday. But it turns out that the Dupont name is this, seemingly, the way it's presented across these two films actually is quite a major, wealthy, historic family. Very much up there with those sorts of names, old money names that they have in America. And as I said in the Foxcatcher discussion, the nature of the shooting of Dave Schultz, the aftermath, and even before that actually, the mental decline of John Dupont really has this Russian tragedy aspect to it, in terms of sort of that deterioration and decline, the decay of a person as the world around them collapses. What's remarkable about the documentary, now having seen the film, the fictional film, and then seen the documentary film, is they paint two very distinct pictures of the same events, but with completely different layers and textures to it. Not to mention the fact that, as I said in the last video, if you read around the subject, there's even further layers to this story that it's quite remarkable exactly how deep this goes and how much goes on surrounding the tragedy and the character of John Dupont and why he did what he did. Team Foxcatcher really wants to focus on the actual wrestlers. I found the documentary really quite difficult insofar as it's a documentary really of two parts. You have the true crime aspect of it and the character analysis, and that is something I am very interested in. And then you have the actual relation, the wrestling community aspect of it. And although when it surrounds the tragedy, I am interested in it because I'm interested in the politics of it, the first half an hour of the film really focuses on the team, on wrestling, on John Dupont's involvement in it, and almost what it tries to do is paint the positive picture of him and how he was perceived before it builds to the more negative side and the troubled side and then the sort of tragedy of the events. But unfortunately, that means there's a good long section of a sports documentary, and I'm just not that... I just don't find it particularly engaging. It's just not something that interests me personally. And so getting through that was quite the slog. But it is necessary groundwork because you need to know the characters surrounding the shooting, not just Dave Schultz and his wife, but also people like Dan Shea, or the security guard who was in the car when John Dupont shot Dave Schultz. there's something weird about the relationship between the Foxcatcher film and the Foxcatcher documentary, or Foxcatcher and Team Foxcatcher, so that's how I'll differentiate between them. Foxcatcher is very much focused on Mark Schultz, his and John DuPont's relationship, the nature of exploitation of the vulnerable by the wealthy, and how isolation affects different people in different ways, and how when Dave steps in to prevent John's exploitation of Mark, that is the trigger that leads to John killing Dave. However, the documentary really breaks that apart in a way that you go, okay, that's not really how it went. The documentary, because Mark Schultz and John, really, they were involved with each other between 84 and 88. Foxcatcher was started as an organisation in the late 80s. John doesn't shoot Dave until 1996. The way the film portrays it is that it all takes place over a year or two, maybe a couple of, over a span of maybe a half decade at most. But it feels like an intense small amount of time, so that as you see the triggers that affect each character take place, you see it feels like it's all significantly more immediate, and the time bomb is imminent. But really, it's not. It's not that way at all. A lot of the way the relationship that Mark and John are portrayed isn't documented how their relationship was. There's a subtext to it, a sexual subtext that implies that John may have been exploiting or abusing Mark in some way sexually. That doesn't exist. In reality, that seemingly was not didn't take place. And the sort of obsession that John has with Mark really can be transplanted more to a different person. Because there are two aspects of it. The sexual exploitation, which was an accusation that a different wrestler made against John in a different occasion, and the obsession. But the obsession that the documentary portrays is one that John has with a man named Valentino, a Bulgarian wrestler who's a world champion and an Olympic champion, and that. And though there's no, the obsession is much more because of his status as a wrestler. It's that jealousy and the fact that Valentine has quite a strong friendship with Dave, and many people in the documentary say that was the thing that really caused friction with John. Additionally, the relationship between Dave and John isn't explored in a great detail over the course of the film. It actually, from when Mark leaves Foxcatcher to the shooting in the Foxcatcher film, really is a short section of the film. Whereas Team Foxcatcher really explores that period, which was practically a decade, maybe just short, somewhere between 6 and 8 years. And it shows the fact that these men weren't isolated in the way Foxcatcher portrayed. That actually there was a community sense to it, that on the farm, that they built this sort of practically internal community system with the wrestlers and the wrestlers' families and John. But the problem with it was the fact that because of John's wealth and because of his very obviously declining mental health, no one wanted to call him out when he started to do very radical things, very intense things. Initially, you might say eccentric, but then veering very quickly into dangerous. And even when it gets to the point where he's acting erratically and dangerously in a way that could harm himself or other people, no one seems to want to step in to prevent it. At least not in a way that would sabotage the sports team or the lives of the people who live on his farm. And that's really where the documentary explores is the fact that it becomes this internal struggle between this man who goes from just being a little eccentric to doing things like crashing his car into a pond, and then with a member of the Olympic Committee in the car doing it a second time the following day, to doing things like looking at footage of his surrounding the forestry around his home and staring at video cam footage of it for hours and hours and hours, and bringing members of the Foxcatcher team in, or his security detail, and saying, oh, do you see that? Do you see this thing? And there's nothing there. But and some members just outright call him out and say, no, I don't see anything. And others play along because either they think it's the best way to appease him, or it means he won't fly off the handle. And so the problem there is that you have this sense of someone who is rich, powerful, and thinks that what they own is their own. Not to mention the extensive gun collection that he has. And the fact that we have this wealthy man with so much power and influence, who is clearly a danger to people and exploits vulnerable people when he can, it feels very familiar, that story does. Surprisingly familiar. I mean, you know, you throw names out like Epstein and Weinstein, and, you know, and there are many, many other cases of this, but it shows the danger of unchecked wealth and power. And I will focus this particularly on sort of the American system of that, and the way that if someone becomes wealthy and powerful enough, they begin to think they are a law unto themselves, and how dangerous that is. But yeah, it's an interesting documentary. It really does open layers, and it showed relationships and even red flags that existed before the shooting happened. For instance, we follow the two characters who we get to speak to the most, who don't get much play in the film, are Nancy Schultz, Dave's wife, and a man named Dan Shea, who both were prominent, and also even Valentine. Also, the three of them all get to say their piece in the documentary. Particularly relevant is Dan Shea, who he himself was threatened by John with a gun very close to when John eventually does murder Dave. And again, it becomes a question of responsibility to someone with mental health, and the fact that nobody reacted to that. There is a certain tragedy element to it. The fact that there is the tragedy of the murder of Dave Schultz, a man who absolutely was murdered for no other reason than someone's psychosis. But then there is also the tragedy of John Dupont, the fact that he was a man who had severe mental health issues, and though, yes, he did a horrific crime, he was treated like a villain as opposed to someone who needed help very urgently, and no one just had the power or security to essentially deal with that. And that really comes to the forefront towards the end of the documentary. I do think it's an interesting piece of, again, true crime, modern American history, and I do think it's a very powerful companion piece with Foxcatcher, and really gives you a different side to it. as I say, there is a third side to it entirely that neither Foxcatcher nor Team Foxcatcher addresses. Things like the fact that John DuPont had an accident when he was young that resulted in him losing his testicles, which feels very relevant. A tragedy, again, like that would cause someone such emotional and physical harm, feels like it would be very relevant but isn't addressed. The fact that he was married but initially became paranoid over the fact that he thought someone was threatening his wife, and then that paranoia transitioned into him believing that she was a spy and threatening her with a gun and pushing her into a fireplace. And accounts like this, which it's fascinating that you could have two narratives that cover the same person, and yet there's still a third narrative that does a completely different aspect to his story and isn't touched on by these other two. The other thing, very quickly, that I'll mention is the fact that, conversely, that Team Foxcatcher does that's very strange, is the fact that Team Foxcatcher never mentions Mark Schultz. Now, being a documentary, there is very much the possibility that Mark Schultz refused to be interviewed and didn't want to be associated, and so therefore the documentarians felt that it would be inappropriate to bring him into it without his consent, plus the period which the film covers doesn't really involve him. But considering how relevant he is to the film, the fact that he isn't mentioned in the documentary is, again, a strange aspect to it. And again, the fact that you can get these different takes that reference things that the others don't it's remarkable. It's a really interesting study between a fictional narrative, a factual narrative, and then stated facts and accounts, and doing a comparison of those three kinds of narrative. As I said, really interesting putting them side by side. Well worth watching, even if, like I say, the sports aspect of the first part of the documentary was a little bit difficult for me. But yes, remarkable. So I'll see you again tomorrow. Take care.